Hello, I'm so glad you're here. Whether it's your first time joining me or you've been here before, welcome. Tonight, let's take a quiet journey far back in time, not to a fairy tale, but to something very real, to the grand, brutal, fascinating world of the Roman Empire. You've heard the stories, the marble temples, the chariots, the togas, the glory of Rome. But let me tell you something. If you were suddenly dropped into that world, you probably wouldn't survive a single day, not because of lions or assassins, but because life back then was utterly different. From food, hygiene, and laws, to how you were expected to behave, walk, sleep, and even die. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is. There always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. So get comfortable. Maybe you're already in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or sitting quietly with a warm drink. Wherever you are, close your eyes or just listen. Let your thoughts drift back to a time of emperors, of slaves, of superstition and a strict order. And together, let's find out why the ancient world would not be kind to you. Take a deep breath, and let's begin. You open your eyes, but there's no sunlight pouring in through clean windows. There's no soft mattress beneath you, no alarm clock, no coffee waiting in the kitchen. Just a low ceiling, the scent of oil lamps, and the rough texture of wool blankets, if you're lucky. You've woken up in the Roman Empire. But before you do anything else, we need to ask, who are you? Because in ancient Rome, your life, your comfort, your safety, even your legal rights, all depended on that. If you were born into a wealthy patrician family, you might be in a domus, a Roman townhouse with mosaic floors and a private courtyard. But if you're like the majority of people, you're in a cramped, poorly ventilated apartment called an insula, stacked 5 or 6 floors high, made of wood and cheap brick. The higher your apartment is, the cheaper it gets, and the more dangerous. Fires were common, collapses too. There's no indoor plumbing, no windows with glass. If you need to relieve yourself, you go to a shared latrine, if your building has one. Otherwise, you might just use a pot and toss it out the window. Yes, this was common practice, a serious hazard in the streets below. If you're a slave, your bed is likely a mat on a stone floor. You may have slept near the kitchen, or in a dark storeroom, or beside the animals. And no, you don't get to decide when you wake up. You wake when you're told, or when you hear the first barked command. Your day begins with labor. If you're a woman, your role depends on your class. But freedom? That's another matter. The Roman world was deeply patriarchal. Even wealthy women lived under the legal authority of their fathers or husbands. Their lives were shaped by modesty, duty, silence. And if you're a child, don't expect toys or school. Many Roman children, especially from poor families, began working as soon as they could walk. So, you're awake now, but you're already tired, aren't you? Let's talk about breakfast. If you're hoping for eggs, toast, or a warm cup of tea, you're going to be disappointed. In ancient Rome, the first meal of the day was called ientaculum, and for most people it was small, sometimes insultingly small. If you're poor, which again the majority of the population was, your breakfast might be nothing more than a piece of coarse bread, maybe dipped in watered-down wine or olive oil. No sugar, no fruit, just a hard, chewy loaf made of barley or millet, grains we'd now consider animal feed. There were no cafes, no grocery stores, no morning cereal, and definitely no coffee. Caffeine wasn't part of the Roman world. So imagine starting a long, brutal day of labor without your usual energy boost. If you were lucky, or had a bit more money, you might have some cheese or olives or a few nuts. But meat? Never in the morning. Romans believed heavy meals early in the day were bad for the body. In fact, many only ate once or twice a day. And drinking milk? That was for children and the sick. Adults avoided it. Even water, and something we now consider essential, could be dangerous. Rome's water, delivered by aqueducts, often passed through lead pipes and was sometimes contaminated. Many people drank diluted wine instead, even in the morning. So here you are, standing in a cramped kitchen if you have one, gnawing on stale bread with no caffeine, no privacy, and possibly no shoes. And you haven't even left the house yet. You step outside, and the first thing that hits you isn't the warm Italian sun. It's the smell. The streets of ancient Rome were not clean. There were no garbage trucks, no street cleaners, no underground sewers in the modern sense. Even though the Romans were known for their advanced aqueducts and public baths, the average street was a chaotic, filthy place. Rotting food, animal dung, human waste thrown from windows, all of it mixed into the dusty, crowded lanes. Flies buzzed everywhere, rats were common, and if it rained, the narrow alleys turned to rivers of mud and sludge. And then there was the noise. Forget your quiet morning walks. The streets echoed with the shouts of vendors, the clatter of wagon wheels, the yells of slaves being ordered about, the barking of stray dogs, and the constant rumble of traffic. Roman law, at one point, banned carts and wagons during daylight hours in the city center to reduce the noise, but that only shifted it to the nighttime. So if you thought you'd get a peaceful night's sleep, think again. And let's talk about crowds. Rome was a mega-city by ancient standards. Perhaps over 1 million people lived there during its height, and most of them lived on top of each other, literally. Tall, wooden insulo, apartment buildings, lined narrow roads that barely allowed two people to walk side by side. Getting through the crowd was an art. There were no sidewalks. You had to watch where you stepped. One wrong move and you might slip in something unpleasant. Or worse, collide with a patrician being carried in a litter and get a beating for your disrespect. There were pickpockets, fights, street performers, beggars. The city was alive, yes, but wild, chaotic, and often dangerous. Now that you're outside, you're faced with another challenge. What you're wearing, or rather, what you're expected to wear. Because in the Roman Empire, clothing wasn't just fashion. It was law, class, identity, and sometimes a death sentence. Let's start with the basics. If you're a Roman citizen, your most formal garment is the toga, that big, white, draped sheet you've probably seen in movies. But what they don't show you is just how heavy, hot, and hard to wear it was. A full toga could weigh nearly 20 pounds, 9 kilograms, and took practice just to put on properly. You couldn't wear it without help. It was like wrapping yourself in a giant curtain and then trying to walk with grace. Togas were uncomfortable, impractical, and worn only on official occasions. Most Romans hated them. So what did you wear daily? If you were a man, most likely a tunic, a simple knee-length shirt made from wool or linen. If you were rich, it was dyed and carefully made. If you were poor, it was coarse, plain, and probably patched. Women wore stolas, long dresses with layered fabric and belts. But no matter your gender, your clothes told people who you were. Certain colors were reserved for the elite. Purple, for example, was incredibly expensive, made from crushed sea snails, and was illegal to wear if you weren't high-ranking. Even shoes showed your rank. Soldiers, slaves, senators, all had different types, and then there were the slaves. Slaves had no legal status, so they often wore the simplest clothing, or were forced to match the appearance their owners wanted. Some wore collars that literally read, "If I run away, return me to my master." If you were enslaved, you didn't choose your clothes. You didn't choose your hairstyle. You didn't choose anything. Even citizens had to be careful. A man wearing a tunic too short could be mocked for being effeminate. A woman with hair unbound might be seen as promiscuous or wild. There were no t-shirts, no jeans, no way to hide behind fashion. Clothes were a uniform, and every thread reminded you of your place. So, you've been walking through the noisy, grimy streets of Rome. You're sweating, you're dusty, and now it's time to get clean. But if you're picturing a private bathroom with running water, think again. In ancient Rome, bathing was public, and not just acceptable, it was expected. The Roman thermae, or public baths, were everywhere. Some were small neighborhood bathhouses. Others were enormous architectural wonders with columns, statues, gardens, even libraries. The baths of Caracalla could hold thousands of bathers at once. But here's the thing. Privacy. Non-existent. Men and women usually bathed separately, but even then, you were still naked and very much on display. Bathing was a social ritual, like going to the gym, the spa, and a cafe, all at once. So how did it work? You'd enter and pay a small fee, unless you were a slave, in which case your master paid, or more likely, didn't. You'd undress in the apoditerium, changing room, and leave your clothes with an attendant. Theft was common, by the way. Then the process began. Tepidarium, the warm room. You'd start here to relax. Caldarium, the hot, steamy room. Think sauna, but with open fires heating water in massive bronze boilers. Frigidarium, the cold plunge. A chilling end to the process. And you didn't just soak. You'd be scraped, literally, using a metal tool called a strigil to remove dirt, oil, and sweat. There was no soap. Instead, you were covered in olive oil, then scraped clean. It worked, mostly. Water was reused. Baths weren't always sanitary. And the drains, let's just say, you didn't want to look too closely. But perhaps the strangest part, people talked business while bathing. They chatted, argued, gossiped, even got legal advice or poetic readings, all while mostly naked and being scrubbed. And women, if you think their experience was gentler, not really. They were judged on posture, modesty, body shape, even more strictly. One wrong gesture, one indecent laugh, and your reputation could vanish. Baths were cleansing, but also humiliating. There was no room to be shy in Rome. You washed your body in front of strangers and you left with nothing hidden, except your thoughts. It's time to get to work. But if you thought your modern job was hard, the Roman version might just break you. Work in the Roman Empire wasn't about climbing a career ladder or finding your passion. It was about survival. And for most, it was grueling, thankless, and often dangerous. Let's start with the lower classes, because they made up the vast majority. If you were a laborer, you might be hauling stone, digging ditches, building roads, or toiling in the hot sun on a construction site. There were no safety laws, no helmets, no gloves. One wrong move, and you could be crushed or maimed and left without compensation. Injured workers were often simply replaced. If you were a farmer, your life was even more exhausting. You woke before dawn, plowed fields with wooden tools, harvested by hand, and carried everything yourself. Insects, blisters, constant sunburn. And then, when taxes came due, Much of your crop went to the state or local officials, leaving you just enough to survive, if you were lucky. But the worst jobs, those went to slaves. Slaves could be miners, forced into underground shafts with little light and no ventilation. These were death sentences, brutal, slow ones. Others worked in mills, chained to grindstones, turning grain into flour for hours, days, weeks. Some worked on ships as rowers, chained to benches, whipped if they slowed. And others lived inside the homes of the wealthy, expected to serve every moment, every mood, and every command without question. Not all slavery looked like chains. Some educated slaves were scribes, tutors, even accountants. But even they had no freedom, no family rights, no legal protections. And if you were a woman, work didn't mean you were spared the home. You cleaned, cooked, fetched water, raised children, cared for the sick, made clothing, all without pause. Poor women might sell goods in markets or work as wet nurses. Others, tragically, were forced into prostitution, often under the control of a male owner. Meanwhile, the rich? They didn't really work at all. Their duty was to manage estates, attend politics, or write philosophy, often while reclining at a villa by the sea. Roman society depended on a system where most people labored constantly, and a few reaped the rewards. So, if you were dropped into this world, it wouldn't matter if you were smart or skilled. What mattered was who you were born to be, and for 90% of people, that meant toil. In modern life, if you break the law, you may face a fine, community service, or jail time. But in ancient Rome, justice was a public spectacle, and punishment wasn't just about guilt, it was about power. The Roman legal system was vast, complex, and, like everything else, stacked heavily in favor of the wealthy and powerful. If you were a citizen, you had some rights. You couldn't be punished without a trial, and you could even appeal to the emperor. But if you were poor, a foreigner, or especially a slave, your rights were close to none. Let's imagine a few crimes that might get you punished in Rome. Stealing bread? You might be whipped in public, branded, or lose a hand. Speaking out against a politician. If you were a citizen, maybe exile. If not, flogging or execution. Being a slave and disobeying an order? Your punishment was whatever your owner decided. And yes, that included death. Slaves could be crucified for minor disobedience. They were property, not people. And the law treated them as such. Even in murder trials, your social status mattered more than the facts. If a wealthy man killed a poor one, maybe a fine. If a poor man killed a noble, torture and public execution. And public it was. Roman punishments were designed to send a message. Crucifixion, the most brutal death, reserved for slaves, rebels, and the worst criminals. You'd hang for days in agony. Thrown to the beasts. Yes, this was real. In the arena, people were fed to lions for the entertainment of crowds. Burning alive, being sewn into a sack with animals and drowned, or having your tongue cut out, all recorded punishments. Even prisons weren't for long-term sentences. They were holding places, damp and rat-infested, where you waited for trial or execution. And remember, there were no lawyers for the poor, no appeals if you weren't elite, no mercy unless someone powerful decided to give it. So, one careless word, one false accusation, one debt unpaid, and your life could be over. Not quietly, not privately, but in full view of a cheering crowd. You've worked, you've endured the streets, you've avoided punishment. Now it's time for fun. Well, by Roman standards, because entertainment in ancient Rome wasn't about joy or creativity. It was about spectacle, power, control, violence. Let's start with the most infamous, the gladiatorial games. Held in massive amphitheaters like the Colosseum, these events were bloody, loud, and brutally popular. Tens of thousands of spectators gathered to cheer as men, and sometimes women, fought to the death. Not all gladiators were slaves. Some were criminals. Some were volunteers hoping for fame and wealth. But make no mistake, their lives were short, and the crowd's hunger for blood was endless. They fought with swords, nets, tridents, and more. Sometimes one-on-one, sometimes many against one, sometimes men against wild animals, lions, tigers, elephants, bears, all imported from across the empire, and killed for sport. And the audience, they cheered, they laughed. They decided, with a gesture, whether a wounded man would live or die. But that wasn't all. There were chariot races, loud, fast, and deadly. Crashes were common, injuries guaranteed. Factions formed, like sports teams, and fans could become violent. Riots broke out in stadiums over racing results. There were theatrical plays, too, but even those could be brutal. In some performances, criminals were executed as part of the drama, their deaths woven into the plot. Executions were timed for lunchtime intermissions at the games. Imagine that. Eating a roasted chicken while watching someone be crucified or burned alive. The Roman elite believed this was all necessary. It distracted the people, gave them a sense of power, reinforced the idea that Rome was in control of life, of death, of everything. So, if you were placed in the front row, you might find yourself sweating, not from heat, but from horror. Because Roman fun wasn't relaxing. It was a test of your stomach. You're hungry. After a long day of walking, working, or watching brutal games, you're ready for a meal. But Roman cuisine? It's not what you think. Yes, they had grapes and olives and wine, but the reality was far more complex, and for many modern stomachs, a little disturbing. Let's start with the poor. Again, the majority. If you were a common Roman, your diet was limited. Daily meals included poules, a kind of porridge made from grains and water, often bland, occasionally flavored with vegetables or bits of lard. Bread, coarse, hard loaves, usually with bits of sand or grit because the flour was ground with stone. Beans, lentils, onions, cheap, filling, and gassy. Olives or olive oil, if you could afford them, and of course, cheap wine, usually watered down. Meat, a luxury. Dairy, rare. Fresh fruit, seasonal and expensive. Now, if you were wealthy, things got strange. The rich Roman elite didn't just eat to live. They dined to show off. Banquets went on for hours, filled with exotic ingredients and outrageous dishes. Some things you might be offered: stuffed dormice, tiny rodents, fattened and baked with nuts and honey; garum, a fermented fish sauce made from rotting fish guts. It was poured on almost everything. Imagine the smell. Flamingo tongue, considered a delicacy. Boiled ostrich, sea urchins, jellyfish, sow's udder stuffed with herbs. Yes, really. And it wasn't just what they ate. It was how they ate. At elite banquets, guests reclined on couches around a central table. They ate lying down with their fingers. Slaves brought course after course while musicians played and poets performed. And when they were full, some used vomiting rooms, a real thing, to empty their stomachs and keep eating. Cleanliness was minimal. There were no forks, no napkins, just bread to wipe your hands. Toilets were often nearby, sometimes even visible. For the poor, food was fuel. For the rich, food was a display of wealth, power, and extravagance. But for you, it might just be a test of endurance, because Roman meals could delight the eyes, fill the stomach, and wreck the senses, all at once. You might think of religion as something sacred, a place of peace, prayer, or reflection. But in ancient Rome, religion was everywhere, in every wall, every shadow, every moment of daily life, and much of it was ruled not by love, but by fear. The Romans believed in dozens, even hundreds of gods. There was a god for your home, for your door hinges, your meals, your crops, your shoes, and if you didn't honor them all, properly and at the right time, something could go terribly wrong. Even your house had its own sacred spirits, the Lares and Penates. Every morning, families made offerings at small shrines inside the home, sometimes with incense, wine, or scraps of food. Forget to honor them, bad luck might follow. Before a journey, marriage, or major decision, people consulted omens. The flight of birds, the way thunder rumbled, even the shape of animal entrails. All were signs from the gods. Yes, animal sacrifice was common, especially in public ceremonies where priests, sometimes state officials, would slaughter bulls, sheep, or pigs to please the gods. If the liver didn't look right, that meant the gods were angry, and everything had to be done again. But it wasn't just the official rituals. Superstition soaked into every moment of Roman life. Trip with your left foot? Bad omen. A crow caws before you speak. Stay home. Dream of teeth falling out? Death is near. People wore protective charms, carried phallus-shaped amulets, and avoided saying certain words aloud. And don't even think about curses. The Romans believed in dark magic. Defictions, or curse tablets, were etched into lead and hidden in graves, wells, or temples. They might read, "Let Marcus never sleep again. Let his tongue swell. Let his love turn to dust." These weren't rare. Archaeologists have found thousands of them, and you couldn't escape it. If your child died, if your crop failed, if your marriage collapsed, you might wonder if you'd angered a god or been cursed by a neighbor. Even emperors feared the gods. Many built lavish temples, hosted games in divine honor, or declared themselves descendants of gods to avoid suspicion and secure loyalty. To live in ancient Rome was to live in constant negotiation with the unknown. Rituals, signs, prayers, not out of devotion, but to survive. When you think of ancient Rome, you might picture powerful senators, mighty legions, and epic monuments. But behind every marble wall were households, families, women, and for them, life was often confined, controlled, and filled with silent expectations. Let's start with marriage. In Rome, marriage wasn't a romantic choice, it was a contract, a transaction, a tool to secure alliances, transfer property, and continue bloodlines. Girls were often married at 12 to 14 years old. Boys, usually in their 20s. Love didn't matter. Consent often didn't either. The girl's father arranged the marriage. Her opinion, it was rarely considered. She passed from the authority of her father, patria potestas, to that of her husband. Once married, a Roman woman, called a matrona, was expected to be modest, faithful, and invisible in public life. She wore covered clothing, styled her hair modestly, and kept to the home. Her duties: bear children, run the household, oversee slaves, remain silent in politics. Even her name came from her family, not her own identity. If her father's name was Julius, she became Julia. If he had more daughters, Julia II, Julia III. And what about divorce? Yes, it existed, and both men and women could initiate it. But women who divorced were heavily judged, and if they had children, custody almost always went to the father. Now let's talk about sex and morality. Despite the modern image of Roman debauchery, Rome was deeply patriarchal and hypocritical. Men were allowed, even expected, to seek out mistresses, concubines, and brothel visits. Their desires were rarely questioned. But women, their honor lived in their chastity. A woman caught in adultery could be exiled, shamed, or even killed by her family. Her husband could legally murder her lover on the spot. Worse still, enslaved women had no rights over their own bodies. They were property, used as their owners wished. They could be bought, sold, or gifted based on their appearance. Some Roman philosophers praised the virtue of Roman wives. But that virtue was rooted in obedience, silence, and endurance. And yet, despite all this, some women resisted quietly. They wrote letters, ran businesses, sponsored poets. A few, like Agrippina and Livia, even manipulated politics from behind the curtain. But for most women, life was a long corridor of duty, lined with locked doors. You might imagine that childhood, even in ancient times, was a carefree age, full of laughter, learning, and play. But in ancient Rome, childhood was fragile, strict, and often shockingly short. Let's start with birth. When a baby was born in a Roman home, it was not automatically accepted into the family. The newborn was placed at the feet of the father. If he picked up the child, it lived. If he turned away, it could be abandoned. This was especially common if the child was deformed, sickly, or simply a girl, when the family only wanted boys. Unwanted infants might be left on hillsides, in alleys, or near temples, where some were taken in as slaves or raised in brothels. Others simply died. Those who survived infancy faced the next challenge: disease. Nearly half of Roman children died before the age of 10. Even noble families weren't immune. Childhood illness, poor sanitation, and malnutrition were relentless. So, if you reached your 5th birthday, you were considered lucky. What was childhood like? For the wealthy, education began early. Boys learned to read, write, recite poetry, and study philosophy. Girls were trained in weaving, housework, and how to manage a household. Preparation for an early marriage. Some boys were sent to rhetoric schools where they learned public speaking, essential for a future in politics. They studied Greek, history, and law. Corporal punishment was common. Teachers carried rods and whips, and discipline was harsh. And the poor. Poor children often did not go to school. They worked, helping in the market, fetching water, tending animals, sweeping shops. For enslaved children, life was labor from the moment they could walk. And play? Yes, Roman children had toys. Small dolls, balls, carved animals, even board games like ludus latrunculorum, an early form of chess. They played outside, sang songs, and told riddles, just like children today. But that innocence was short-lived. Boys came of age around 14, marked by a ceremony where they received a toga virilis, the toga of manhood. Girls, often married by 12, left their childhood behind in silence. There was little room for adolescence. You moved from childhood to expectation, quickly and often without choice. And if a child died, some families wept bitterly. Others accepted it with grim philosophy. Death comes to all. Mourn not what is natural. Toys were passed down, names were reused, and life, cruelly, continued. So, you've made it through a Roman day. You've eaten, bathed, maybe even watched a gladiator fight. But now something feels off. A fever, a cough, a strange ache in your side. You're sick, and in ancient Rome, that's a terrifying thing to be, because medicine, as we know it, didn't exist. No antibiotics, no anesthesia, no knowledge of germs. Roman doctors did what they could, with tools that were crude, treatments that were painful, and beliefs that were often dead wrong. Let's start with the basics. If you had money, you might summon a medicus, a trained physician. But even the best ones worked with theories dating back to Hippocrates and Galen, based on balancing 4 humors in the body: blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If you were sick, they believed one of these was out of balance. The solution: bleeding you with knives or leeches, purging with vomiting or laxatives, or applying hot cups, strange herbs, or even animal dung. And surgery. Yes, the Romans did surgeries. They had scalpels, forceps, bone drills, and cauterizing irons. But there was no anesthesia. A tooth extraction, an amputation, or cutting into an infected wound, all done while awake. For serious cases, they might offer wine as a sedative, but it barely helped. Many patients died not from illness, but from the cure. And if you were poor, you likely never saw a doctor. You relied on folk remedies, passed down by neighbors or older women. Charms, prayers, boiled herbs, whispered spells. People believed that disease came from the gods or from miasma, bad air. So they burned incense, hung garlic, or sacrificed animals to beg for mercy. And hospitals? There were some, mostly for soldiers, not civilians. If you weren't a soldier or a slave owned by a wealthy household, you suffered at home, often in silence, often alone. Even minor injuries could kill. A small cut might become infected. A broken bone could leave you crippled. A bad fever could mean death within days. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Roman women, even noble women, died regularly in labor. There were no safe techniques, no painkillers, and no real understanding of hygiene. And the infants. As we've seen, many never reached their first birthday. So yes, Romans built aqueducts, roads, and monuments. But if your body failed you, the empire could do little to help. Imagine waking up every day knowing you don't own your life. You don't choose where to go, what to eat, who to love. You are property, a thing, a tool. That was the reality for millions in the Roman Empire. Slavery in Rome wasn't based on race. It was based on conquest, poverty, or simply bad luck. If you were captured in war, born to an enslaved mother, or sold by desperate parents, you became a slave. And your life? It was not your own. What did slavery look like? It depended. Rome had many types of slaves. Domestic slaves worked inside homes of the wealthy. They cleaned, cooked, cared for children, dressed their masters, and answered to every whim. Agricultural slaves labored on vast country estates, planting, harvesting, and dying in the fields. Mine slaves were the worst off, sent into deep shafts with no light, no ventilation, and little chance of survival. Their life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Public slaves worked for the government, building roads, maintaining temples, or acting as scribes. And then there were gladiators, often slaves trained to fight and die for public amusement. Some slaves were educated. Greek tutors, musicians, doctors, all technically property. But status didn't protect you. At any moment, a master could punish you, whip you, starve you, sell you, or kill you, without reason. There were no legal protections. A slave could not marry legally, could not own anything, not even their own name. If a master was killed, all his slaves could be executed in retaliation, guilty or not. And women? Female slaves were especially vulnerable. They were forced not just into labor, but into sexual exploitation, with no recourse. Some were kept in brothels, others used as concubines or sold to the highest bidder. And yet, the Romans saw all this as normal. They believed freedom was a privilege, not a right. But not all slaves remained slaves forever. Some were manumitted, freed by their masters for loyalty, service, or payment. Freedmen could work, marry, and even grow wealthy. Some even owned slaves of their own, the cycle repeating endlessly. But most never escaped. They lived their lives unseen, unheard, and unnamed. And yet, without them, the empire would have collapsed. Every road, every building, every meal served in an elite home, built on their backs. You've seen the soldiers in films, proud, armored, standing tall, but living as one. It was grueling, dangerous, and often deadly. The Roman military wasn't just a fighting force, it was a machine. Efficient, relentless, and absolutely unforgiving. Let's start with recruitment. If you were a citizen male, usually between 17 and 25, you could be conscripted or volunteer. Once accepted, you swore an oath of loyalty, the sacramentum, to the emperor and to Rome. From that moment, you belonged to the army. Daily life as a legionary. It wasn't all battles and glory. Most of your time was spent marching, digging, building, and training. Soldiers built roads, forts, and even entire cities. They were skilled engineers and hard laborers. Marches could span 20 to 30 kilometers per day in full gear. Armor, weapons, rations, and personal gear. All packed on your back. Discipline was absolute. Disobey orders? You might be flogged. Desert? You could be executed. If a group of soldiers mutinied or fled, the punishment could be decimation, where 1 in every 10 men was randomly selected and beaten to death by the others. Brutal, public, memorable. In battle, Roman soldiers were trained to fight in tight formations, shields locked, swords drawn. The gladius, a short stabbing sword, was deadly in close combat. Legions used tactics, not chaos. But battles were still hell. Screams, blood, mud, arrows, wounds festered, amputations were crude. Many died not in combat but from infection, thirst, or being trampled by their own side. And the enemies. Barbarians, rebels, rival empires, all fought fiercely. Rome won many wars, but not without massive losses. Off the battlefield, soldiers lived in barracks, cramped, smoky, and shared with dozens of others. They cooked their own food, cleaned their own gear, and kept watch in rotations. Marriage was officially forbidden during service, though many had unofficial wives and children nearby. Some settled down after retirement, if they lived that long. Retirement. After 25 years of service, yes, 25, a legionary could retire. If he was lucky, he might be granted a plot of land, a lump sum payment, or Roman citizenship, if he didn't have it already, but many never made it that far. They died in battlefields far from home, under foreign skies, fighting wars they didn't choose. And yet, to be a Roman soldier was, to many, an honor. It was a path to stability, to land, to legacy. But make no mistake, the glory of Rome was written in blood. In ancient Rome, death was not hidden. It walked beside you, whispered in your ear, and shaped how you lived. Plagues swept the cities. Soldiers died on foreign soil. Children passed in infancy. And yet, Romans did not fear death the way we might today. They prepared for it, spoke of it, and honored it, with rituals older than memory. The moment of death. When a Roman lay dying, family gathered. The eldest son would try to catch the last breath of the dying person, a sacred moment. Then the eyes were closed and the body washed, anointed, and dressed, often in a white toga. A coin, the obol, might be placed under the tongue. Why? to pay Charon, the mythical ferryman who guided souls across the river Styx. Funerals. For the wealthy, funerals were grand affairs. A procession of mourners, musicians, and masked actors walked the streets. They carried the body, or ashes, to the necropolis, literally city of the dead, outside the city walls. Eulogies were given, sacrifices made, offerings burned. Sometimes professional mourners were hired. Women who cried loudly, tore their hair, and wailed dramatically to show grief. The body could be buried or cremated, depending on the time period and social class. Tombs ranged from simple urns to massive family mausoleums. Inscriptions often read, "I was not, I was, I am not, I care not," a reminder that death was final. For the poor were buried in communal graves, often unmarked, but even the poorest Roman hoped for a dignified end, and families saved what they could for basic rights. Slaves, if they died young, might be given modest funerals by kind masters, or none at all. But even in death, status mattered. The afterlife Romans believed in shades, spirits of the dead who lived on in the underworld. If you honored your dead ancestors, their spirits, the manes, would protect you. If you forgot them, they might become restless, wandering ghosts called lemures, who returned to haunt the living. So families kept small household shrines and performed yearly rituals to feed the dead. Milk, wine, honey, even bits of cake, left at graves. There was no single view of the afterlife. Some believed in a realm of reward and punishment. Others saw death as eternal sleep. But everyone, rich or poor, shared one belief. You are remembered only as long as your name is spoken. To die was one thing. To be forgotten was worse. Let's say you've just woken up in a bustling Roman city, perhaps Ostia, or maybe even Rome itself. You rise from your straw mattress, stretch your aching limbs, and prepare to begin the day. But here's the catch. You won't be showering, not in the way you're used to. In fact, you'd likely be visiting a public bathhouse known as a thermae. And it won't just be about hygiene. In ancient Rome, bathing was as much a social ritual as a practical need. The bathing routine. You'd begin by entering the apoditerium, the changing room. You'd leave your belongings in a small niche, watched over, if you're lucky, by an attendant. If not, they might get stolen. Then, step by step. First, the tepidarium, a warm room to open your pores. Next, the caldarium, a steaming hot chamber. You'd sweat profusely. Then you'd be scraped clean with a strigil, a curved metal tool, after oil had been applied. Soap didn't exist yet. Finally, you'd enter the frigidarium, the cold room, to close your pores and finish the cycle. It sounds refreshing, doesn't it? Until you remember you're doing this with dozens or hundreds of other people, all sharing the same pools. And the water? Not drained daily. Toilets and sanitation. Public toilets were common, but they were not private. They were long stone benches with holes, side by side, where you'd sit elbow to elbow with strangers. There was no toilet paper. Instead, a shared sponge on a stick, soaked in salt water or vinegar. Yes, shared. If that sounds dreadful, well, it was. But it also speaks to how communal life in Rome truly was. Streets and smells. Even with aqueducts and sewage systems, the cities of Rome were ripe. Chamber pots were dumped from upper windows into the streets. Animal waste filled alleyways. The air was thick with the scent of tanneries, latrines, fish markets. No perfumes could fully hide it. Living in Rome meant constantly navigating filth, and doing so with dignity. Let's imagine that something went wrong during your day. Maybe you spoke disrespectfully to a patrician. Maybe you stole a loaf of bread. Or maybe you were just in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Welcome to the world of Roman justice, a system of rights and rules, but not fairness as we know it. Innocent until proven guilty? Yes, the phrase comes from Roman law. E incumbit probatio qui dicit, non qui negat. The burden of proof is on the accuser, but in practice, it depended entirely on who you were. A Roman citizen had certain legal protections. A slave, none. A woman, fewer. A foreigner, maybe none at all. Punishments were rarely subtle. The punishment's justice could be public flogging, forced labor in mines, crucifixion, for slaves or rebels, execution by beasts, in the amphitheater exile, for disgraced elites. Even minor infractions might be punished with beatings or branding. And if you were enslaved, your master had the legal right to torture or kill you without consequence. Surveillance and snitches. There was no CCV, but there were informants, spies, and accusers for hire. In fact, in later imperial Rome, it became a profession. Delatores made money by accusing others. If you had a good orator to defend you, someone trained in the art of persuasion, you might be spared. But if you were poor, foreign, or disliked, you were on your own, and punishment wasn't always private. It might be public for all to see. A message, obey, or this could be you. Chapter 8, the Roman workday, labor, heat, and survival. Let's say you made it past the courts and kept your freedom. Now comes the reality of daily work. What would your job be? It depends on your status, but for most people, especially plebeians and slaves, it was laborious, exhausting, and dangerous. The laboring masses. You might be a porter, carrying goods through the narrow streets, a mason, working in the heat of a construction site, a sailor hauling grain up the Tiber, a fuller bleaching cloth with urine, a slave working from sunrise to sundown without pay or choice. There were no weekends, no labor laws, no safety equipment. If you were injured, you were replaceable. Heat and hunger. Roman summer was stifling. Stone buildings trapped heat. Water was precious. In poor areas, even shade was rare. Add hunger, since food distributions, a nona, didn't always meet needs, and you had a recipe for unrest. People fainted, rioted, even revolted. And still, the empire expected order. The lucky few. If you were educated, male, and wealthy, you might have been a scribe, lawyer, or senator. But even elite men lived with fear. Fear of political downfall, fear of betrayal, fear of imperial wrath. In Rome, status protected, but never guaranteed, survival. Would you have lasted a day? If you were tough, obedient, lucky, maybe. But for most, daily life in the Roman Empire wasn't the glory of marble columns and heroism. It was sweat. It was danger. It was resilience in the face of power. And as you drift to sleep tonight, maybe give thanks for warm water, quiet streets, and soft sheets, because in ancient Rome, those were luxuries few ever knew. And now, our journey through ancient Rome comes to a close. You've walked the crowded streets, felt the dust on your skin, heard the clash of swords, the roar of crowds, the silence of sorrow. You've seen how they lived, how they suffered, how they found joy, and how they feared the shadows. Would you have survived a single day? Perhaps, but you would never have left unchanged. So now, as you rest, in the safety of your own world, let the voices of the past drift quietly into dreams. Let the weight of time settle soft on your shoulders. And remember, history is not distant. It's right here, breathing with us in the dark. Good night. Those who survived infancy faced the next challenge: disease. Nearly half of Roman children died before the age of 10. Even noble families weren't immune. Childhood illness, poor sanitation, and malnutrition were relentless. So, if you reached your 5th birthday, you were considered lucky. What was childhood like? For the wealthy, education began early. Boys learned to read, write, recite poetry, and study philosophy. Girls were trained in weaving, housework, and how to manage a household. Preparation for an early marriage. Some boys were sent to rhetoric schools where they learned public speaking, essential for a future in politics. They studied Greek, history, and law. Corporal punishment was common. Teachers carried rods and whips, and discipline was harsh. And the poor. Poor children often did not go to school. They worked, helping in the market, fetching water, tending animals, sweeping shops. For enslaved children, life was labor from the moment they could walk. And play? Yes, Roman children had toys. Small dolls, balls, carved animals, even board games like ludus latrunculorum, an early form of chess. They played outside, sang songs, and told riddles, just like children today. But that innocence was short-lived. Boys came of age around 14, marked by a ceremony where they received a toga virilis, the toga of manhood. Girls, often married by 12, left their childhood behind in silence. There was little room for adolescence. You moved from childhood to expectation, quickly and often without choice. And if a child died, some families wept bitterly. Others accepted it with grim philosophy. Death comes to all. Mourn not what is natural. Toys were passed down, names were reused, and life, cruelly, continued. So, you've made it through a Roman day. You've eaten, bathed, maybe even watched a gladiator fight. But now something feels off. A fever, a cough, a strange ache in your side. You're sick, and in ancient Rome, that's a terrifying thing to be, because medicine, as we know it, didn't exist. No antibiotics, no anesthesia, no knowledge of germs. Roman doctors did what they could, with tools that were crude, treatments that were painful, and beliefs that were often dead wrong. Let's start with the basics. If you had money, you might summon a medicus, a trained physician. But even the best ones worked with theories dating back to Hippocrates and Galen, based on balancing 4 humors in the body: blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If you were sick, they believed one of these was out of balance. The solution: bleeding you with knives or leeches, purging with vomiting or laxatives, or applying hot cups, strange herbs, or even animal dung. And surgery. Yes, the Romans did surgeries. They had scalpels, forceps, bone drills, and cauterizing irons. But there was no anesthesia. A tooth extraction, an amputation, or cutting into an infected wound, all done while awake. For serious cases, they might offer wine as a sedative, but it barely helped. Many patients died not from illness, but from the cure. And if you were poor, you likely never saw a doctor. You relied on folk remedies, passed down by neighbors or older women. Charms, prayers, boiled herbs, whispered spells. People believed that disease came from the gods or from miasma, bad air. So they burned incense, hung garlic, or sacrificed animals to beg for mercy. And hospitals? There were some, mostly for soldiers, not civilians. If you weren't a soldier or a slave owned by a wealthy household, you suffered at home, often in silence, often alone. Even minor injuries could kill. A small cut might become infected. A broken bone could leave you crippled. A bad fever could mean death within days. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Roman women, even noble women, died regularly in labor. There were no safe techniques, no painkillers, and no real understanding of hygiene. And the infants? As we've seen, many never reached their first birthday. So yes, Romans built aqueducts, roads, and monuments. But if your body failed you, the empire could do little to help. Imagine waking up every day knowing you don't own your life. You don't choose where to go, what to eat, who to love. You are property, a thing, a tool. That was the reality for millions in the Roman Empire. Slavery in Rome wasn't based on race. It was based on conquest, poverty, or simply bad luck. If you were captured in war, born to an enslaved mother, or sold by desperate parents, you became a slave. And your life? It was not your own. What did slavery look like? It depended. Rome had many types of slaves. Domestic slaves worked inside homes of the wealthy. They cleaned, cooked, cared for children, dressed their masters, and answered to every whim. Agricultural slaves labored on vast country estates, planting, harvesting, and dying in the fields.